I knew that if we didn't start with a diverse work group, that we would never have one.
What would happen if we just told the truth?
Welcome to TruthWorks, where we dig into the nitty-gritty of leadership and work.
And what needs to change. I'm Jessica Neal.
And I'm Patty McCord.
Our journey together started in HR, but trust us, it's evolved into something wild, honest, and well, a bit rebellious.
So throw out the handbook. We're here to redefine rules to work for us, not against us.
Let's dive into another episode. Welcome to another episode of TruthWorks. I am here with my favorite person in the world, Patty McCord.
Same here. And we're going to get a little wild today, aren't we?
I think so. I don't know. It's almost Friday. And why not? You know,
why
I'm
not?
a little tired. I didn't get a lot of sleep last night. I got home at like 2 a.m. from travel.
And you're sitting on a stuffed bunny. Let's just tell
And
our
I'm
listeners.
sitting on, because I'm in my son's playroom because there's somebody doing some work at my house and it's loud by my office. And so I'm sitting at his little preschool table and it hurts my ass.
Yeah.
So I have a bony butt. And so I had to put a bunny under
and
there.
I was just going to say, it reminds me of an episode of Portlandia, right?
Yeah.
Instead of put a bird on it, you put a bunny under your butt or whatever. Anyway, so today, the subject that we want to talk about is on a lot of people's minds and is now very controversial, which is the elimination of DEI programs. And what Jessica and I have talked a little bit about this, and what we want to talk about today is very much our own lived experience of this and not the cliches around DEI. So maybe we can first start with what do those words mean?
Yes, let's do that.
It's diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's what DEI means. And in fact, in the last couple of years, I think we added a couple more letters.
They did, yeah.
And I would say that anytime an effort becomes an HR program, that becomes an acronym, that keeps adding letters, you're kind of in trouble anyway. So I just want to put my bias out there to start with, because one of the problems is it's become this thing instead of an effort.
A strategy.
Or a strategy, right? So I'll start off talking about diversity. So, you all know I've been around since dirt. And
a little after dirt.
Well, back in the day, I ran diversity programs for a company called Sun Microsystems. And that was mostly...
And this was in the 90s, yes?
Yeah, in the 90s. And it was mostly focused on affirmative action. And in particular, having more women in the tech workforce.
And Patty, remind people why affirmative action happened.
Affirmative action happened because it was a government-sponsored program to get workforces to be more reflective of the available pool of workers. And so the affirmative action process was, and probably still is, for government-owned companies or companies with government contracts, that you had to have your workforce, your flow into the workforce, your flow through the ranks of promotion. And when you exit, when you'd have a layoff, it was to make sure that none of those things adversely impacted types of employees that were underrepresented. So, for example, the company that I worked for then was a tech company. And at the time, probably 30% of the population was Hispanic, right? And so the company did not have a representation of 30% of Hispanic workers, partly because the qualifications for being a software engineer at the time were that you had to have a degree in software engineering. And so the population wasn't just hire more Hispanics, it was make sure that you have the representation of the people that are qualified for the jobs. So there was tons of conversation about meritocracy. Meritocracy meaning you only hire the most qualified candidate, and you don't pick somebody just because of the color of their skin or their race. The other thing that was really, really important back in those days was making sure that we had more female representation in the workforce. And what we found,
you didn't at that time,
but because we, especially in tech.
Yeah.
Right. And there's lots of great work about that. My friend Emily Chang wrote a terrific book called Brotopia. And it was about sort of who became the engineers in the Silicon Valley, because most of the programmers were people who had written programs on their home computers. And oh, by the way, home computers were marketed to boys because the only thing you could do with them was build video games. So that was sort of that particular thing. And what happened was the data showed when I was there in the 90s that we actually, through efforts, did a pretty good job at representation in the hiring process. But when I started to look at the data in terms of internal promotions, that was back when we were coining the term glass ceiling. It was cement. I mean, you could count on one hand the number of women that passed whatever grade 11, into the more senior executive roles. Still is. And the deal was that we only recruited the top 1% of the top 1% of the top, the schools.
Right.
And it was still, even if we got the most, they still wouldn't go through the promotion process. And by the way, the other thing we analyzed was when we do layoffs, was their adverse impact. Did we end up doing a great job hiring all these different people and then laying them all off when we had a layoff? So that was what diversity was when I started. And it was very much focused from the programmatic perspective inside the company as a recruiting effort. And that's probably where you remember it too, right?
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about your experience with diversity recruiting.
Well, I just remember when I was a headhunter, I would have these very large companies that had government contracts saying, hey, I need you to find me an engineer, but a special engineer. And I was like, wait, special how?
Yeah.
From this area of the world or from this area of the world. And I'm like, okay. So they were trying to meet metrics. And, if they didn't, some of their government contracts would be at risk. So that was sort of my very first sort of push into it. But what I realized at that time and what I realized in my career is that when you're just doing it to hit a number, like that's not the right way to think about it. That's not the right way to go about it. It's not going to be beneficial to the person you're hiring. It's also not going to be beneficial to your bottom line. And for me, and what I've learned about diversity is that if you can build a workforce that is representative of your customers, right? Like you get a lot of bang for your buck for that.
And perspective.
Yeah, because they see the world the way that your customer sees the world, and you don't see the world that way.
Yeah.
And that doesn't, it's everything from hiring people that are working in a different country because you're going global to people that are local working in a different city because, if you're in a certain part of Los Angeles versus Boston, that's a different experience.
Exactly. And the other thing is that I think we both know this deep in our bones, which is like hires, like hires, like hires, like, right? And so we've both worked for plenty of very well-educated white men who only want to hire very well-educated white men because the best people are very well-educated white men.
Of course they are.
And what we found, I think you and I both, was we knew this, that's just not true.
No.
And they won't see, for example, very well-educated, qualified white women unless they meet one, right? And I remember coming to Netflix. So my experience was the first company I worked at had 150,000 people globally. The next company had 80,000 people. Right. So by the time I got to Netflix and we were 30 people, I knew that if we didn't start with a diverse work group, that we would never have one, or that it would be this big, hard effort.
Huge rock.
A huge rock. And so I tried really hard at the beginning to make sure that as a startup that we found people that were really the best people to work on our startup. And because Netflix was a consumer brand, it was really, really important to have those different perspectives. I mean, I personally was a quality engineer for many, many Netflix products because I represented somebody that wasn't a white male engineer. You know, I would say, no, that's not how it works in the real world. Well, how do you know? I'm like, because I live in it and you don't. Yeah. And the other thing was, it was a real boon for being a recruiter because, you know, most people recruit, I call it the fishing metaphor, right? They drag a big net through the San Francisco Bay and they get 6 bazillion fish. And what they're hoping for is a trout, right? And they might or might not get a wayward trout. But if you go to that little quiet, dark pool and that pond in the Sierras, and so what I found was niche recruiting allowed me to get like the best of the best of that particular population.
Yeah.
And it was, I applied the same learning that I had about only the right schools, only the right companies to that within a subset. And I got really amazing people because I got people who really wanted to not be a number and people who really wanted to contribute and represent the customer. But at the beginning, the diversity, the point I'm trying to make here is the beginning, diversity was mostly about hiring.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it still is.
Yeah. Right.
You know, I mean, I think that has been the goal. And a lot of companies they've made some progress and I think focusing on it helps, right?
Right.
But what I learned about, if you want to have this diverse workforce that is representative of your customers, you do have to put effort around thinking differently about hiring, where you're sourcing people from, what you really need in the role. Are there things that you're not thinking about, right? That someone's going to bring to the table that, just what you put on the job description doesn't really, kind of tell that story for, right? But it's hard to sort of break the chain and the system of people hire their friends and their networks and their friends and their networks look like them. And so you really do have to be very intentional, right? About like reaching out to places you wouldn't reach out to, trying things that you didn't try.
And this begat a lot of the work that we did in our function around getting better at interviewing, getting better at assessing people, getting better at writing better job descriptions that weren't just a laundry list of things that everybody else had. And realizing that as a company, my expertise tends to be companies at a scaling place, right? And when you scale, you're going to need different people than all the people that you have. So then I realized that for me was, first of all, putting people in front of hiring managers that they weren't used to seeing, teaching them about hiring for the job and not the person, right? And opening their eyes to, so one of the dilemmas at the beginning was, it was this chicken and egg situation, right? You couldn't have a diverse workforce unless you had a diverse workforce. And if you had a diverse
because they walk in the building, it's a bunch of white men. They're like, no thanks.
I used to tell people, I'm like, you walk in, you sit down in that reception, you come a half an hour early and you watch who's walking in and out of the door, who's obviously in charge, who's making decisions, who's acting subservient, how many are there. That'll tell you what the workforce looks like. Okay. So then we start getting better at it. And I remember like having a number of women in the workforce and all of a sudden, because I was the affirmative action officer. So now I'm not only looking at the data of, what representation is, I start looking at salaries and holy shit. I mean, It's not just like, yeah, Jessica makes a little less than Fred, but he's more special than Jessica. Jessica makes half.
Probably less than half.
And Jessica, when I am rating and ranking her, is like 11 steps above Fred.
Mm-hmm.
But Fred's a favorite, and he went to school with them, and so that.
Well, the other issue is like, because you are sort of a woman or some sort of minority in the workforce, your salary is already behind, right?
Yeah.
Your other company was behind, and then nobody writes the check to bring you up to Fred.
One of my favorite stories is I had written my book, and I was doing a talk at the Conference for Women in Texas, the Texas Conference for Women, right? And it's huge conference. So afterwards, I'm doing a Q&A, and all these people are standing around talking to me. And this wonderful woman, and she says, I realized that I wasn't being paid as much as my cohorts, right? And I said, well, how'd you know that? She's like, well, I asked them and they told me. And it was a lot. The difference was a lot. And one of the guys I worked with literally didn't work. I mean, like, he came in late, he left early, he didn't do anything. And I was hustling, I was getting twice as much work. I was doing a great job. And so I got really brave, and I went to my manager and I said, I talked to John and he doesn't even work. And you know that. And I know that. I make half as much as me. And she said, her boss said, honey, when you've been here as long as John, you'll have earned the right to not work very much either. And, you're just going to have to be patient. And that's the way it works around here. And you're doing a good job. So just put your head down and keep it up and, hang out for some number of years. And, maybe one day you'll be successful too. And all the women are standing around like, ah. And I said, well, where do you work? And she said, for the state of Texas. And I said, oh, why did you go there? Did your parents work for the state? Oh, yes. And listen to this. It's a secure job.
Yeah.
Right. And the benefits are good. And, and I said, well, tell me what you do. And she said, I'm a data scientist.
Wow.
Right. And so 3 women are like, oh my God, I'll hire you right now. Like, whatever you're saying. Can I take you to lunch? Can I take you to dinner? And I said, so you can see that there's a lot of opportunities for you. You're in a very in-demand job. Yeah. And the reason why your coworker isn't doing it is because he can't.
Yeah.
He doesn't know how, and you do. And she said, but I love our data. I'm like, there's data.
You can love data somewhere else.
But the reason I'm bringing it up was that, she had gotten to the point where she knew it wasn't fair.
Yeah.
But the system was so rigged that, and so what I wrote in my book was, here's the deal, right? If you're in a job that's paying you under market by, 20%.
Yeah.
And you take another job and they give you, a little bit raise, and then you work your ass off and you kill it, and they give you the top of the bell curve, and you get, it's a 6.5% merit increase, and you get an 11%, and HR and your boss tell you, oh, so you're amazing, you got you still suck.
Yeah. You're still below.
And it compounds. And that begat equity.
Yep.
Which is actually an offshoot of meritocracy, which is you not only hire if you're only hiring the best people, then pay them what they're worth.
Yeah.
Period.
Well, yeah. But then, the problem was they'd like go get the data on the women, and the data on the women was 20 to 30% less than the men.
Right.
So it's like, well, that's the market data.
Yeah, right. But then we started thinking about so that's why diversity first, equity second, which is, okay, now that we're really starting to see a pretty diverse workforce, are we treating people fairly?
Yeah.
And that's a very American concept. Mm-hmm. Meritocracy and fairness and doing the right thing and, paying people for their effort.
Yeah. And I mean, like in other countries, when you have a global company, like, it's so pro-employee, but on both men and women.
Yeah.
It's like everybody gets the same. And, it's very hard to let people go. They're almost on these contracts right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that's right either, but there is some things that I think are interesting for the US to take away from that, building a better system that allows, I think what they're trying to do is allow for more fairness. And I'm not a big believer in everything's apple to apples, everything has to be fair.
Yeah.
However, I do believe that if someone is just as skilled as another and one's not a white male,
Right.
that they should be paid the same as the white male.
Which led us to, why is this happening?
Yeah.
Right. So for those of us with curious hearts and brains, we said, okay, if we were to break this cycle, are there other factors involved that are affecting this inequity? Right.
Mm-hmm.
Because diversity, equity means not inequity.
Mm-hmm.
I know, she's brilliant, right? So
you are.
Now you're thinking, well, are some people just coming into the interview disadvantaged in some way? Right. And is it because they didn't get into Harvard and they didn't get into whatever, or their experience? This is a great one leading off of this. Their experience was in a government agency and not, for us, not a startup, not in high tech, and these were the days before everything was high tech. Right.
Yeah.
So that now there's no such thing as a non-tech company. I mean, there's not a company in the world that doesn't have a website. There's not a company in the world that doesn't have an online presence. So like it's all
good tech or bad tech.
At this point, it's all tech. But you started to realize, were the traditional historic Black colleges producing great tech candidates? Were we looking at, I discovered at Netflix, my aha discovery was I hired people out of Lawrence Livermore Lab, which was
I remember when we were on that kick.
Yeah, we're on that kick. And it's like, we discovered this pocket of
great,
brilliant scientists. We realized that at the time, we were looking for people with experience analyzing very large data sets, and there weren't any in our peer companies.
Yeah.
They were in the government.
Yeah. And they were great.
But when we started mining that trench, they're all underpaid.
They were totally underpaid because it was the government. And then we gave them the Netflix with
but they had to perform, right?
Yeah, but they did.
Yeah. And so I think the point about diversity and equity, since we're at that point, is like, this was totally possible. And it wasn't like, oh my God, we had to shut the company down to find qualified candidates that were not the traditional candidates that were already in our company. And by the way, when we did hire them and they did perform and they were amazing, then we became the kind of company that attracted the same qualified candidates who didn't feel like they were represented in other companies, which took us to inclusion.
Well, yeah. And before we go on to inclusion, I just want to talk about, like, when I got to have the privilege of having your role after you had it. I remember I was at this offsite, it was like with all of our executives, and we were in Brazil. And, this was, I guess, 2017, 2018, somewhere in there.
Mm-hmm.
And, everyone was very excited about diversity and wanted more, because I think, people in business had started to see that, this is good. Like, this is good for business. And I think they wanted to, and this will kind of lead us into inclusion, but I think they wanted to learn more, about people that were different than them, even though it was uncomfortable. But the trend that I was seeing was that they wanted someone else to do all the work. It was like, okay, I really want to have a diverse team. Okay.
HR, please take care of that for me.
Go find me one.
Yeah.
I also want to be a leader and have a team that, allows for these people to be successful. So can you do that too? And it's like, no. I cannot. You can, though. And I remember having this like big conversation, and I was sort of nervous to say what I was going to say. And I was like, you all keep looking at me and my team as that we're the solution for this. And I'm here to tell you we're not. We're fucking not the solution. You are the solution. You want diversity? You have to be intentional about it. You have to work for it. You have to make an effort. And if my team's the only one making an effort, because guess what? We are. We're making an effort. But if we're the only ones making an effort, we will never be diverse. We will not be inclusive. So you've got to do the fucking work.
Yeah. Right.
And I'm like cussing at them and like yelling at them. This was the same conversation. I told them that my husband was a Republican and they, half the group almost passed out. But, they still love me, which, because I guess I'm a Democrat, so they still love me. But, and even in that and saying that, I was like, whew. Well, we got a lot of work to do, because if I'm just saying that my husband's a Republican and that's shocking to you, like, you're not inclusive.
Right.
By the way,
right. Right.
This isn't just inclusive of people that believe in what you believe.
Yeah.
This is like, or that look, that look differently than you.
And act like you, right? Because we're looking for people who are charismatic and good decision makers but I think a couple of things. The good news was that because we had a lot of introverts, we were already kind of inclusive for people who were different than the external people.
That's true.
The other thing that started to happen was, again, now we have lots of different kinds of people in our company, and it's starting to look like our customer base.
Yeah.
But we're not listening to them.
Exactly.
Then you start looking at, my training was like, okay, who's leaving?
Yeah, no. And that's the truth. And so then, so I have this like kind of yell at them, and they're all fired up because they like to get yelled at.
Yeah.
And they're like, we're going to do it, Jessica. We're going to do the work. And I'm like, all right, well, I'll believe it when I see it. And then I was getting, and this was like when the chief diversity officers were on the rise, and I was getting enormous pressure from the business. Mm-hmm. Like, you have to hire somebody. And I was like, I really have this big fear that if I hire someone to do this,
this will be their job.
Well, yeah. And it's going to stop we have all this great momentum. Everybody's stoked. Everybody's doing the work. We're making progress. It's not a have to do. It's a need to do. And then if I bring this person in, it's going to just stifle all of that. I ended up getting the right person, and it was Vernay, and she was amazing. I got all this pressure, and I remember like just resisting, and then Reed was like, you really need to do this. And I was like, I get it, but I'm going to find the right person. And this is not an offense to the diversity officers, but there were a bunch of diversity officers that weren't maybe practical, right? Is more, I don't know what the right word is, but they weren't moving the needle really.
Or they were gonna right the wrong by being mad,
or something,
or whatever. I mean, the other thing that we talked about earlier, once these things become an HR initiative,
right?
Then
and that was my fear.
Then all responsibility moves to that person or entity or team.
Yeah,
and the rest of the business goes, done.
Yeah,
right. Not my problem anymore. No big deal. And because many, many, many HR initiatives don't move the business forward, the reputation HR initiatives have is that it's frivolous,
a waste,
and it's nice to have, but not a must have, which is what I'm hearing now, right? This is a waste. This is a waste of time and effort.
Yeah. And so, I'm getting a lot of pressure. I end up doing it, but I'm very glad that I did. And I think if I had not hired Vernay, I probably wouldn't have gone as well. And I think she's just a very special woman. But when I was hiring her, what I decided to do in the interim of hiring someone was I was like, okay, we can dibble dabble with these diversity consultants.
Yeah.
Because they're all trying to get
There's
these jobs.
a million of them. Right.
Let's see. And if they're helpful, maybe that'll help me wrap my head around this, change my mind. And Vernay was one of our consultants. And we had an executive in the company who, it's very public, but he said the N-word in a meeting, high-level person. And we had to let him go. And I remember calling Vernay for advice because she was our consultant. And it was like, the other white men that I work for probably aren't going to be very helpful
Right.
in this conversation. So let me use one of these consultants. And so I ping her, and she was just, I mean, her advice to me was like, look at your values. Your values will help you make the right decision.
Mm-hmm.
And she was so right. And why she was great for Netflix is that Netflix, and this, we're sort of go-doers, we're practical, we like things that move and she was like that. And
Mm-hmm.
so it worked for a long time. But then, to sort of your point of like, does it become like this HR initiative? Then her team was getting as big as my HR business partner team.
Mm-hmm.
And so then we had HR business partners, and then we had a whole big diversity team that were partnering with the business and the functions. And then it was like, well, who is the HR business partner?
Mm-hmm.
Is it the diversity partner, or is
Mm-hmm.
it the HR business partner? And then the HR business partner, with some of the more kind of tougher to figure out diversity issues that might be happening in the organization, those HR business partners weren't as equipped to kind
Mm-hmm.
of deal with it as these. And so I remember Reed saying to me, he's like, I don't want you to build 2 HR teams.
Right. Well, but as I'm listening to you,
Yeah.
I'm thinking about it like any other new technology trend, right?
Yeah.
Let's assume it was a technology. So right now, I would imagine that every company has an AI team.
Yeah.
Right. And they're hard to find, and they're amazing, and everybody's got to do it. Everybody's got to do it. Everybody's got to figure it out. Right. And it's hard to find, and there aren't very many of them, and they're going to, right. And I've just seen this waves of new things that come in. And then eventually everybody will use it, right? Everybody will understand it. And then we won't have that specialized team.
Yeah.
And then, oh, by the way, it just absorbs back into the organization and becomes part of the way we do business. And I think that maybe your story is like the pendulum swings on everything in a business. Maybe we overdid it. It's time to correct.
Well, what I started to realize, I was like, okay, like, I don't want to build 2 HR teams, but I do want an HR team that is good at this.
Yeah.
Right. And this group is good at it. This group isn't. Right. So let's take the ones that aren't good at it.
Yeah.
Let's get them trained up in it.
Yeah.
What I have learned in working with, global and diverse teams is that, you're usually coming from things with your perspective. And so, trying to come at it from a different perspective, or understanding, what it's like, perhaps not that you'll ever understand. We don't share the lived experiences, but can you push yourself to try to understand and think a little bit differently? And so we started to do all that work, and it started to pay off. And then the folks that weren't getting it, didn't scale in the organization.
But you didn't throw it out.
No.
Right.
No,
you didn't
no.
get rid of it. And one of the things that we wanted to talk about that we both feel is really important is that talking to people who are listening to us about our lived experience is that we made a lot of progress.
Yeah.
And we really do have, at least most of the companies and places I go to, have a fairly diverse workforce. God only knows the federal government does.
Yeah.
Because the federal government has always been open to most qualified people. They take tests, right? Yeah. Anyway, we don't throw it out. It becomes a part of the way we do business, and then we build on that strength and move it forward. And so the thing that's disturbing me right now is like, we're throwing away something that made us stronger, right? That made us better global citizens, that made us more in tune with what our customer base really looks like. Turning back time has never been a very clever business. I mean, because we come from innovative businesses. It's like, yeah, let's go back to having somebody go change the channels on the TV.
Yeah. No, nobody wants that. And I think the confusion, in any business, that there are things that you try and it pays off. And there are things that you try and they don't.
Yep.
And I think that there was a wave of effort around diversity, equity, inclusion that came from one of the best places, right? And it was a push and everybody was wanting it and like, how do we do it and how do we do it better? And there was a bunch of things that organizations tried, including ours. And some of those things were successful and some of those things weren't. And I think that is healthy, right?
Yeah, right.
Because, you're going to try things, you're going to put in place programs that don't net you the results that you want.
Right.
Right. And it's okay to get rid of those, but it's not okay to go back in time. And it's not okay to say that these things, DEI doesn't matter. But I think that the media and whomever has turned the DEI into
a thing,
a bad thing. It's like they're just going to hire these people who, are going to take my jobs and it's not that. It's literally not that. And I think most of us that are in the business world understand that. Now, did some programs go overboard? Maybe.
Yeah.
And do some of those need to be rolled back? Probably.
Yeah.
But the intention and the effort has been going on for years, right? And I don't think this can stop. I mean, and you have really great organizations like Sam's Club and Costco. Like, no, this is important to our business.
We are a community business. We're going to hire people from the community. We want our workforce to look like our community because we want our customers to come in and see people that look like them helping them. Okay.
Yes.
Wow. That's radical.
Right. Right.
Right.
And then you have I don't know, I was listening to Mr. Zuckerberg talk about it. And, Facebook's been public about, the DEI stuff. And he was talking about masculinity in the workforce. And he was saying that, look, efforts around, being an inclusive place for everyone and women and people of color, like that's all great. But, masculinity has been stifled. I don't know his exact words, but that was like what he was saying. And I'm listening in the car. I was like, oh my goodness. And it's like, how?
And more importantly, why? What? I mean, what? Why? I mean, so we're so practical, right? So the pragmatic Patty says, okay, so what? I mean, and that's what lost you customers. Aren't most Facebook, let's go to Facebook, not Meta as a whole. Yeah. But aren't most Facebook customers women?
Yeah. And older.
Right. And older women and, whatever. Let's say the new thing is a masculine workforce and we hire masculine workforce, head of masculine, whatever. Right. I don't know that our experience shows us that that's a better outcome than the one we're working on right now.
I'm pretty sure it doesn't.
Because the world is diverse.
Yes.
Our country is diverse. Our consumers are diverse, right? And so the nostalgia for bringing us back to a world that hasn't existed for 50 years is, to me, the innovator in me is like, really? Like that, it's always been a good idea to go backwards, said no one ever.
Said no one ever.
Right. So I think that what we want to talk about in this podcast is just, let's talk about it. Yeah. Right. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about what we've actually done. Let's talk about what we feel like actually worked. Let's talk about where we went overboard. Especially you HR people listening out there. Hello, when it becomes an acronym and it has more than 3 letters, it's an HR initiative that typically goes nowhere. So beware. Of the HR initiative. And I think you were absolutely right when it was like, okay, we got to go hire somebody to fix this for us. Maybe that's how you grow the garden, is you start with the seed, right? And I certainly have experienced this in tech, right? There's always something new and we should always embrace that. But I'm perfectly okay with stopping and reflecting and going, okay, what's working and what's not working. But I think it's a real mistake to stop and go, well, that was a total failure and it didn't work. And there's a different way of doing things. It's what we did in 1957, and we should go back to doing that. So
agreed. And I think that's where people have it all wrong. And that's what makes me, a little bit sad. It's like, okay, we're just going to throw it all out. No, it's okay to throw out the things that aren't working, but and this effort has been going on for years, decades, right? And there has been progress made, and there is money on the bottom line, that companies can see because they're making efforts around this. And so, for the HR people listening, is what you're doing moving the needle for the business and the people, right? Both. Right?
Because they are one and the same,
Yeah.
Like people are, it's the people. It's like, well, duh.
Yeah.
I mean, show me a business that works with that. Maybe we won't. I mean, but even then, somebody's got to program the AI bots. So
I know. I don't know, Patty.
Well, I think I think it's really important that we give a voice to people who have actually worked on this.
Yeah.
Because I think it's easy in the abstract. And I think that all of us need to step back and go, what do we want our companies to look like, and how do we want to serve our communities? And that they
our
are
customers.
and our customers, and they aren't separate entities. Right? They are all part of the whole thing.
Yeah, I'm an optimistic person.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that are being said in the media. There's a lot of things that are perhaps being done or trying to get done within government, which I think, some of these things will be hard to be pushed through and finalized. So, let's not freak out until we need to. But most, I would say, logical companies, which I think are the majority, get that this is important.
Yeah.
And I don't think companies are going to throw out their efforts.
Our strength as Americans, I think, is our ability to innovate and be new and look at the world differently and try and make it better for all of us. So
yeah. And I think that generally that's how the majority of Americans feel. Well, Patty, I just want to thank you for having the conversation with me, because you are the person that I always love to go have these conversations with.
Oh, me too. And I love being out there in the world and trying to figure out, what are the things that we did and still do that make a difference, and wanting to still do that in my life and yours. And I think this is one of the things that we did that made a difference. And
too.
I'm not ready to give up.
No, me neither. Nobody's giving. Well, here's the thing, everybody. Nobody's giving up.
Yeah, right.
That's just not a thing.
Yeah.
Will we rethink? And will we perhaps spend the dollars differently? Yes.
Yeah.
But this isn't going away. Don't worry.
Thanks for listening to Truth Works. This episode was produced by Megan Hayward. Thank you to Kathleen Speckert and the whole Edit Audio team.